30 years ago, a mysterious organization conducted human experiments using a device called the Berserk Wheel. In this process, they created a type of monster called player and made them fight each other for the entertainment of wealthy spectators. However, these players only engaged in killing driven by their instincts. They had no human consciousness at all. But one day the players developed a consciousness of their own and killed the researchers and all the spectators. Amidst the chaos, Dr. Goro escaped with a newly born player in his arms. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye, and Goro, along with the player he named Jean, went into hiding in the slums. Goro taught Jean to always maintain a sense of justice, regardless of the circumstances. One day, a prostitute named Akemi was being followed by a group of thugs and cornered in an alley. At that moment, Jean appeared on the wall and told Akemi that he could save her if she paid 10,000 yuan. Akemi agreed immediately, and upon hearing this, Jean took action. He swiftly knocked down one thug and sent the other two flying with a single punch. This terrifying power was clearly beyond that of an ordinary young boy. After dealing with this group of people, Jean was about to demand payment from Akemi. However, his two friends, Kuga and Konoha, the siblings, arrived at the scene. Kuga believed that doing good deeds should not require compensation and promptly took Jean away. The three of them were very close friends and frequently engaged in acts of justice together. However, in the evening, Akemi still gave the money to Jean and handed him a business card promising to treat him to a meal. When Jean returned home that night, he discovered corpses scattered around and his grandfather lying in a pool of blood. Goro and Jean bid their final farewell, and then Goro passed away in the pouring rain. Jean pushed Goro's body, hoping to find a doctor to save him. However, when he sought medical help, the doctor turned him away due to his lack of money. Helpless, Jean remembered his best friend, Kuga, but he never answered the phone. Meanwhile, Kuga's father was reprimanding him and his sister, Konoha, for maintaining the honor of the Amaji family and forbidding them from associating with homeless orphans like Jean. At that moment of despair, Jean remembered Akemi and decided to visit her workplace. Akemi did not despise Jean, who appeared like a beggar. She kindly took Jean to the hospital and the police station to handle the necessary procedures for his grandfather's death. Afterwards, Akemi brought Jean back to her home. While spending time together, Akemi couldn't help but recall her own missing child. Learning that Jean had no parents and had relied solely on his grandfather, Akemi's heart ached even more for him. On that day, a couple was casually discussing the recent series of murders on the street, unaware of the approaching man. Meanwhile, as Akemi and Jean grew closer over time, she started treating him like her own child. That evening, while they were returning home from shopping, a long tongue suddenly shot out, piercing Akemi's abdomen. Akemi was about to call the police, but her phone was instantly destroyed. She could only urge Jean to escape. However, Jean no longer willing to experience the pain of losing loved ones, the man directly pierced Jin's chest. It turns out he's the one who killed Jin's grandfather. Then the man threw Jean aside and tried to kill him, but just in time Akemi pushed the man away, enraging him. The man retaliated and attacked Akemi with a scream. Akemi slowly fell to the ground. Jean watched as Akemi's blood scattered in the air. A surge of power seemed to awaken within him. Meanwhile, as the man continued to expand, and then he turned into a lizard man. Filled with anger, Jean stared down at the monstrous creature below. Suddenly, a terrifying power surged through his body. Jean propelled himself forward at an unimaginable speed. With just one strike, the lizard man was instantly slain. The next morning, Jean woke up in the hospital. The police had returned his grandfather's belongings to him. Jean felt incredibly fortunate that Akemi had survived, although she had been disfigured. The two embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. In a dark underground research facility, a dormant player suddenly awakened. Surprisingly, his form bore a striking resemblance to Jean. However, due to the absence of something crucial, this player can only be called a defective product. This was the result of 5 years of research conducted by Mitsukai, the president of the Amaji Corporation, and Dr. Tanaka. Years had passed, and Jean had grown into adulthood. Akemi had resigned from her previous job, and the two now lived together in the slums, relying on each other for survival. One day, Jean coincidentally encountered his childhood companion Konoha. Konoha immediately rushed back to inform his older brother Kuga about the news. As the eldest son of the Amaji family, Kuga shone like a radiant star, drawing attention from all around. His sense of justice remained unwavering. When he heard about Jean, he was overjoyed. However, Kuga had important matters to attend to at the moment. Someone has been setting fires all over the place lately, and Kuga has been looking for the arsonist. The location of the arsonist has finally been revealed, and the culprit is not human at all. Meanwhile, Jean caught a whiff of an unusual scent and followed it to the scene of a fire. Just then, the arsonist burst through the wall. He questioned Jean, wondering why their scents were similar. At the same time, Kuga arrived on the scene, witnessing Jean emerging from the rubble. The two locked eyes, both surprised by the unexpected encounter. They discovered several trapped individuals and divided their tasks. Kuga took charge of the rescue operation, while Jean went in search of the fire-breathing monster's trail. Suddenly, the monster leaped down, impaling Jin's chest. However, the mysterious power within Jean awakened. Once again, Jean delivered a powerful punch, shattering the monster's arm. But as long as there was fire, the creature's body could regenerate. The monster continued to absorb flames to restore its body. Jean doesn't want to waste any more time. He pierced the creature's heart with a decisive blow. The battle ended, and the ground began to crumble. At that moment, Jin's heart skipped a beat. Then he lost consciousness. He was quickly rushed to the hospital, and there Mitsukai, the chairman of the Amaji group, discovered the pattern on his hand. It turned out that Jean was the ultimate form of the player they had been searching for all along, an entity known as Zetman. When Jean woke up, he discovered a monster devouring Akemi, who turned out to be Jin's clone. Anger instantly flooded Jin's mind, and a terrifying power surged through his body. He smashed open the massive iron door and slowly walked out in the observation room. Dr. Tanaka rapidly recorded data. Jean had not fully evolved into Zetman yet, but even so the power within him surpassed all the players. The clone charged forward, and in a sudden punch it struck Jean. Unexpectedly, the experimental data became abnormal. Jean seemed to have no intention of fighting back, further fueling the clone's frenzy. It relentlessly attacked Jean, but when the clone prepared for a final strike, Jean suddenly turned around. With just one blow, he shattered the clone's body. After the battle, the data showed that Jin's cellular tissue began to deteriorate. If this continued, his body will gradually disintegrate. At that moment, Jean punched the tempered glass. He was prepared to kill them all and avenge Akemi. Just then, Akemi's voice came from behind Jean, and simultaneously an alarm sounded from the machines. Jin's body had started to disintegrate, and there seemed to be no solution. Suddenly, a voice of an old man echoed from a sealed room in the laboratory. The only way to halt Jin's body from deteriorating was to exterminate all the players present. Zetman had an innate instinct to hunt players, and once it lost its target, Jean would revert to his human form. However, the Akemi standing in front of Jean was no longer human, as she emitted the scent of a player. In that moment, a man suddenly shot and killed Akemi. With Akemi's demise, Jin's body data returned to normal. The person in the sealed room turned out to be Jin's deceased grandfather, Goro. When Jean woke up, he found himself locked up. Mitsukai took Jean to an underground basement, the very place where the monsters and Jean were created. Then Mitsukai revealed his true purpose, to kill all the players. Currently, the monsters were disguising themselves as humans among the crowd, and the Berserk Wheel device in front of them could forcefully revert the monsters back to their original form. The pattern on the back of Jin's hand possessed the same power back in the day the Amaji cartel. In order to make a huge profit, Mitsukai created the player through human experimentation, but later regretted his actions. In order to atone, he and Jin's grandfather Goro created Jean as a means to hunt down these monsters. However, Goro didn't want Jean to become a tool of slaughter, so he fled with him. Just then Mitsukai told him another piece of news. Akemi hadn't actually died. All the previous scenes were illusions created by Mitsukai. Mitsukai prevented Jean from seeing Akemi because, as a Zetman, players would constantly pursue him. Being near Akemi would put her life in danger. In order to ensure Akemi's safety, Mitsukai advised Jean to never see her again. Though cruel, it was the reality. In the end, Jean agreed to Mitsukai's persuasion, but made a condition to cure Akemi's face and find her lost child. Mitsukai readily agreed to his conditions. Meanwhile, a man arrived at the place where the players were created, picking up a shard of the Berserk Wheel from the ground, seemingly plotting something. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. During these 2 years, Jean has been training as per Mitsukai's instructions, constantly evolving towards the ultimate form of Zetman. Meanwhile, 3 monsters roam the streets, ruthlessly slaughtering humans, and this scene is witnessed by a passing girl. By chance, upon seeing the girl flee, the monsters become even more excited. Eventually, the girl ran to Jin's place. This place is a specially prepared area by Mitsukai for Jean, surrounded by surveillance cameras. When Jean returns home, he immediately notices the girl hiding in the corner. Seeing that Jean is not a monster, the girl quickly tells him about the incident she just witnessed. In an instant, Jean realizes that the 3 monsters the girl saw are players. Concerned for the girl's safety, Jean decides to let her stay temporarily. He then prepares a fried rice dish for her. However, at that moment, Jean suddenly smells a foul odor, which is the scent of the players. He immediately goes out to search, and since the girl is afraid to be alone at home, she follows him, but when she steps out of the house, Jean was gone. At that moment, she finds her lost bag in the middle of the road, but it turns out to be a trap set by the monsters. The girl is instantly subdued by the monsters. In a critical moment, Jean appears out of nowhere to prevent the girl from seeing things she shouldn't. Mitsukai quickly sends someone to use a tranquilizer gun to render her unconscious. Meanwhile, the battle between Jean and the monsters intensifies, but Jean in his human form clearly struggles against the transformed monsters. At this moment, the monster's body spurts out a lot of foam and Jin's body melts. In an instant, after sustaining a fatal injury, the Zetman power within Jean is fully activated. At this point, Jin's body has turned completely white. This also catches Mitsukai's attention, as Jean is indeed continuously evolving. However, the monster from earlier is not dead yet. Just as it prepares to escape, cleaners who specialize in eliminating and eradicating players discover it. They work for a mysterious organization. At that moment, Jean returned to his human form, but suddenly Cleaner appeared behind him and stabbed him with a knife. At that moment, the mysterious figure Kasumi arrives. He told Cleaner that if he killed Jean, Boss will be angry subsequently. The Cleaner leaves the scene. Kasumi said he didn't mean any harm. He was just waiting for Jean to grow uppy. When the girl regained consciousness from her coma, Jean had already prepared lunch for her. From their conversation, Jean also learned that the girl's name was Hanako. On the other side, Kuga encountered an old man named Jairu. On his way home from school, Jairu revealed himself as Kuga's fan and expressed his desire to confirm whether Kuga had a sense of justice. He decided to test Kuga and pulled out his phone. The video on the phone showed Kuga's sister Konoha being abused. Kuga knew that Konoha couldn't swim at all, and he grew increasingly anxious. Jairu then informed him that a murder would occur shortly, and the victims would be 3 fans who supported Kuga. Jairu presented Kuga with 2 choices: to save his sister Konoha or to save 3 unrelated strangers. Jairu also wanted to know which side Kuga, who claimed to be righteous, would choose to rescue. In the end, Kuga chose to go to Konoha's side only to find out that Konoha was actually practicing swimming with her coach. Meanwhile, the 3 unknown girls had already been brutally killed on the street. It was clear that Kuga had not passed Jairu's test, and Jairu was preparing a second test for him. At the same time, Kasumi started to take action. He found the 2 escaped monsters from before and incited them to kill Jean. Just as Jean was about to go out to buy ingredients, he coincidentally encountered Konoha, who had come looking for him. Jean warns Konoha not to come back here because he is afraid that Konoha will be attacked by a player. However, Konoha did not understand Jin's intentions and could only wander the streets alone, shedding tears of sadness. Soon, Konoha and her classmate were targeted by the 2 monsters. The cockroach-like creatures kidnapped the 2 girls and took them to an abandoned building. Konoha secretly dialed her brother Kuga's phone and pleaded for help. Kuga immediately searched for Konoha's location and quickly put on his newly developed combat suit to rush to the scene. The cockroach creature delighted in tormenting humans, and it used its nails to cut Konoha's neck, relishing in the sight of her terrified and helpless appearance. Meanwhile, Jean sensed the presence of the player and hurried back to the place he had just passed, only to find Konoha's abandoned shoes on the ground. He had intended to rescue Konoha immediately, but the monster had already found him. However, Jean did not have any energy supplements with him at the moment, so he couldn't enter combat mode quickly. He can only be beaten up by the monster unilaterally. Jean was continuously beaten by the monster, but his survival instinct triggered the release of his Zetman powers. Jean grabbed an iron rod and pierced it through the creature's body, then immediately headed towards Konoha's location. At that moment, rescuing Konoha became the top priority. However, when Jean found Konoha, she was already lying weakly on the ground, having lost too much blood. Jean quickly picked her up, but in the next second, the hidden cockroach creature attacked Jean, impaling him through the chest. Jean could only fight back against the creature while enduring his severe injuries, but he was clearly at a disadvantage. Meanwhile, Kuga arrived on the scene wearing his combat suit and instantly eliminated all the monsters present with a few beams of light. Kuga told Jin to get Konoha and the other girl to a safe place. Kuga immediately went to look for another monster. However, this monster was constantly splitting into duplicates, and Kuga realized that he had little chance of winning. At the same time, Kasumi approached Jin, kicking him to the ground. Kasumi believed that every time Jin faced a life-threatening situation, he would awaken his Zetman powers and become Zetman. Kasumi inserted a steel nail infused with a fragment of the berserk wheel into Jin's chest, causing Jin to writhe in pain as the nail gradually merged with his body. Jin's body began to evolve, and Kasumi calmly watched everything unfold. Suddenly, Jin's body started transforming into a red form, causing the surrounding buildings to shatter. Under his immense aura, Kasumi stood silently on top of a high-rise building, witnessing the birth of Zetman. Jin felt a surge of power and immediately went after the heavily injured cockroach creature, easily killing it with a single blow. However, Kasumi appeared in front of him again. Jin questioned Kasumi about his true intentions and immediately wanted to use the berserk wheel to expose Kasumi's true form. But Kasumi was different from the previous monsters. He had a special constitution as a player and was not affected by the berserk wheel at all. Jin launched an attack against him, but Kasumi effortlessly evaded it. Meanwhile, Kuga was still battling the monster, but it was evident that Kuga was no match for the transformed creatures. Just at that moment, the monster immediately split into several clones. This monster had the ability to transfer its essence to its clones, so if these clones were not all killed together, the monster would continue to multiply. Although Jin's power greatly increased in his red form, it was clear that he had not yet fully adapted to this newfound strength. His movements became sluggish, and the monster seized the opportunity, stabbing Jin's body and causing the steel pins in his chest to shatter. His body reverted back to its white form. Faced with the sudden attack from the monster, Jin could only barely defend himself, but Kuga swiftly grabbed the monster from behind. Seeing this, Jin immediately took hold of Kuga's sword and swung it at the monster. With the combined efforts of the two, they finally managed to overcome the crisis. As the player vanished, Jin returned to his human form. At that moment, Jin was completely exhausted. Kuga hugged his friend, whom he hadn't seen in years. Tears came to his eyes. Kuga sent Jin back home, but they discovered that Jin's room was filled with sand. Jin immediately realized that a player had invaded his home. He hurriedly searched for Hanako, but fortunately she had only fainted. Mitsukai never expected Kuga to learn about the existence of players in this manner. As a result, Mitsukai revealed everything to his grandson, including the truth about Jin's origins. On the other hand, Jin and Hanako spent time together and quickly developed into a couple. Jin told Hanako to go home first, as he had other matters to attend to. Later, Jin and Kuga arrived at Mitsukai's research lab together. There, Mitsukai disclosed the entire truth to them. He and Jin's grandfather Goro had once collaborated on the development of a completely different type of artificial human called Net. But there was a mistake in the development process, transforming N into Z, giving rise to Zetman. Afterward, Mitsukai decided to use Zetman as the ultimate weapon to eliminate players. However, Jin's grandfather Goro was not dead. This news shocked Jin to the core, as he had seen his grandfather take his last breath with his own eyes. Mitsukai, not intending to conceal the truth, then asked Jin to personally meet the current Goro. Goro was now reduced to a mere head. When Mitsukai found Goro's body, his brain had not died, so Mitsukai brought him back. Faced with a grandfather living in such agony, Jin ultimately chose to end his grandfather's life with his own hands. The last words his grandfather left Jin were asking if he had been eating well. At the same time, his grandfather revealed to Jin the method to achieve the ultimate form of Zetman, which was the red stone necklace that Jin had always worn around his chest. However, the current whereabouts of the necklace were in Konoha's hands. However, at this moment, Kasumi also learned of this news and promptly snatched the necklace from Konoha's hands. In the early hours of the morning, Kasumi took control of the entire television station, revealing the existence and origins of players to the people. He also called for all players to incite a riot, resulting in the city being instantly ravaged by players. Meanwhile, Jin immediately went to the streets to hunt down the players. While he successfully saved some humans, he was also perceived by humans as a monster. During Jin's absence, Hanako, who was at home, was also captured by the players. Jin couldn't allow Kasumi to continue wreaking havoc, so he immediately arrived at the location where Kasumi was. However, Kasumi remained completely composed, knowing that only Jin in his white form was no match for him. Soon, Kasumi severely injured Jin. Kasumi then pulled out the steel nail made from Jin's necklace and prepared to pierce it into his chest. At that moment, Kuga arrived just in time. However, Kuga's father, Shizo, driven by his family's interests, shockingly demanded that Kuga kill Jin. Kuga knew his father's evil. He couldn't forgive his father for what he had done. Kuga immediately aimed his gun at Shizo. Seeing the situation exposed, Shizo immediately ordered his subordinates to kill Kuga without any consideration for their father-son relationship. Witnessing this, Kuga hesitated no more and shot his father in the head. However, his mother, in an attempt to rescue Shizo, also suffered serious injuries. Kuga immediately turned his attention towards Kasumi. Upon seeing this, Kasumi promptly commanded all the players present to reveal their true forms. The entire venue descended into chaos. In an instant, Kasumi tossed the steel nail in front of Jin, giving him the choice to become Zetman's ultimate form or not. Kuga didn't want Jin to insert the steel nail into his body because he might lose his human consciousness. Meanwhile, Kasumi had Hanako bound at the scene, seeing his beloved woman held hostage. Jin hesitated no more and was about to pierce the steel nail into his own chest. At that moment, Jin fully evolved into Zetman's ultimate form. Under the influence of his berserk wheel, all the hidden players present went berserk. However, Jin was unaware that his deeply loved woman was also a player. Hanako, who was frightened, began to destroy everything around her. Everything she touched turned into sand. Instantly, Jin intended to awaken Hanako's consciousness, but Kuga, driven by his sense of justice, directly severed Hanako in half with his sword. Witnessing this scene, Jin could only scream in grief. At that moment, Kuga launched an attack on the transformed Kasumi. But clearly Kuga was no match for Kasumi. In just a few moves, Kuga was severely injured. Jin made his own decision. At this point, he immediately picked up Kuga's sword blade. Seeing Jin now fully in his evolved form, Kasumi said that his wish had come true. It was worth dying, for Jin ultimately punched through his chest, ending Kasumi's life. 3 years quickly passed. The events that happened on that night 3 years ago gradually faded from people's memories. However, those players lurking in the deepest corners of human society continued to harm innocent lives. Kuga, as before, hunted down players in the name of his own justice. Meanwhile, another person lurked in the darkness, relentlessly hunting players. No one praised him and no one noticed him. Even so, that person continued to fight, choosing to live in the darkness for the sake of light, and that man's name was Zetman.